President Donald Trump is warning of an economic and national security disaster if the Supreme Court overturns its use of emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on nearly every country. Speaking Monday, Trump claimed the tariffs have generated trillions in tariff and investment income.
The numbers were reported so incorrectly. The real numbers are trillions of dollars have been taken in or gotten in terms of investment from the tariffs.
Trump had previously floated the idea of using tariff revenues to pay for what he calls a dividend to lower-earning Americans, and repeated his plans on Monday.
We're going to issue a dividend to our middle-income people and lower-income people of about $2,000, and we're going to use the remaining tariffs to lower our debt.
During last week's oral arguments on the tariff case, Supreme Court justices cast doubt on Trump's authority to impose tariffs under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which contains no references to tariffs. Justice Amy Coney Barrett suggested it could be a mess for the courts to administer refunds to U.S. importers who have paid tariffs that were declared illegal. Trump took issue with media reports about the amount of duties collected that the government might have to repay if the Supreme Court agrees with a lower court that Trump's sweeping tariffs were illegal.
So they're not giving the right numbers. It would be an economic disaster. It would be a national security disaster if we lost the case in the Supreme Court.
It remains unclear exactly when the highest court will rule.
Okay, so imagine you're Donald Trump. You spent your entire presidency pushing the boundaries of executive power, testing what you can get away with, claiming authority that no previous president claimed, and then the Supreme Court, including justices you appointed, looks at what you're doing and says no. Not just no, but hell no. That's what just happened. The Supreme Court handed Trump his biggest legal defeat yet, and I mean biggest, not in terms of drama or headlines, but in terms of actual impact, actual constraints on presidential power, actual consequences for Trump's agenda. The court struck down his global tariffs, said he doesn't have the authority to impose them, said he manufactured an emergency to bypass Congress, said the powers he claimed don't actually exist, and they didn't just rule against him. They explained in detail why what he's doing threatens the entire constitutional system, why unchecked executive power is dangerous, why the balance between branches of government matters. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a narrow decision where one justice made the difference. This was a clear, decisive rebuke of Trump's approach to presidential power. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court today heard arguments about President Trump's sweeping tariff policies.
The case revolves around the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 and whether it's an overreach of executive power.
CBS News Miami's Erica Brown tells us what the early indications are from the High Court.
Inside the Supreme Court Wednesday, the Trump administration argued the president has the legal authority to impose sweeping tariffs on foreign countries without congressional approval.
We don't contend that what's being exercised here is the power to tax. It's the power to regulate foreign commerce. These are regulatory tariffs. They are not revenue-raising tariffs.
President Trump relied on a 1977 emergency law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose the tariffs. But several justices, including some conservatives, questioned the administration's interpretation of that law and where to draw the line.
What would prohibit Congress from just abdicating all responsibility to regulate foreign commerce, for that matter, declare war, to the president?
We don't contend that he could do that. If it did.
Why not?
Attorney Neil Katyal argued on behalf of the small businesses who brought the lawsuit.
The justices ask tough questions, but fair questions.
These tariffs don't punish foreign governments. They punish American small businesses, American workers, and American families.
And the immediate impact? Massive. Billions of dollars in tariffs are now invalid, have to be refunded. Economic policies built on those tariffs have to be unwound. The administration has to comply immediately with lower court orders on issues like food benefits for families. Can't delay, can't appeal further, has to do it now. And beyond the immediate financial impact, this decision creates a legal framework that constrains Trump going forward, that gives lower courts and Congress tools to push back against his other claims of executive authority. That makes it clear the judiciary won't just rubber stamp whatever Trump wants to do, and that's huge, because Trump's entire strategy has been based on the assumption that he could do whatever he wanted and worry about the legal consequences later, could claim emergency powers, could bypass Congress, could ignore court orders by appealing endlessly, and now the Supreme Court is saying that's over, that there are real limits. That presidential power is constrained by the Constitution and by law, and those constraints will be enforced. Legal analysts are calling this a watershed moment, a turning point, the sharpest judicial rebuke of Trump's presidency, and they're not exaggerating, because this decision isn't just about tariffs, it's about the fundamental question of how much power a president has, whether the executive branch can just make up authority, whether emergency powers can be invoked whenever it's politically convenient, whether Congress matters at all, or whether the president can govern alone. And the court said no to all of that, said the Constitution creates a system of separated powers for a reason, said Congress has specific authorities, including the power to levy taxes and regulate trade, that the president can't just take for himself, said that when a president claims emergency powers, those claims have to be real, have to be justified, can't just be pretext for doing what you want, and Trump's tariffs failed all of those tests, failed so badly that even conservative justices who usually give presidents broad deference said this crossed the line, said this was too much, said this threatened the constitutional order. And here's what makes this even more devastating for Trump. The decision focused heavily on something called the major questions doctrine. This is a legal principle that says when an agency or the executive branch claims authority to make decisions with massive economic or political significance, that authority has to be clearly granted by Congress. You can't just find some vague statute and interpret it to give yourself unlimited power. And that's exactly what Trump tried to do with tariffs. He claimed that a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act gave him authority to impose global tariffs during emergencies, and the court said no, said that law doesn't give you unlimited authority, said Congress never intended for presidents to use emergency powers to create sweeping trade regimes, said that if authority this significant exists, it has to be explicit, has to be clear, can't just be inferred from vague language. And since Trump couldn't point to clear congressional authorization, his tariffs are invalid, have to be struck down. And that reasoning, that emphasis on the major questions doctrine, it applies to so many other things Trump is trying to do, so many other claims of executive authority. So this one decision undermines huge parts of his agenda. The court also addressed SNAP benefits. These are food assistance payments that millions of American families depend on. And during the shutdown, Trump's administration decided to only make partial payments, to use the shutdown as leverage, as a way to pressure Democrats. And the court said that's arbitrary and capricious, said you can't use food benefits for millions of families as a political weapon, said the administration has to resume full funding immediately, has to comply with lower court orders, can't keep appealing and delaying, and that's significant because it shows the court isn't going to let Trump use government services as bargaining chips, isn't going to let him hurt vulnerable people to gain political advantage, is going to enforce basic standards of how government operates, and that limits Trump's options going forward, makes it harder for him to manufacture crises, harder for him to use leverage that hurts ordinary Americans, harder for him to govern by chaos and coercion. And the political implications? They're massive. Because Trump has built his presidency on the image of strength, of winning, of never backing down, and now the Supreme Court, the court where he appointed 3 justices, has handed him a crushing defeat, has said his signature economic policy is illegal, has stripped away powers he claimed, has constrained his presidency in fundamental ways, and that makes him look weak, makes his supporters question whether he's really winning, makes his opponents more aggressive, gives them confidence that the courts will check Trump's excesses, and it creates momentum for more challenges, more lawsuits, more attempts to use the courts to constrain Trump, because if the Supreme Court is willing to rule against him this decisively, if even conservative justices are saying he's gone too far, then there's hope that judicial oversight can work, that accountability is possible, that Trump can't just do whatever he wants. So buckle up, because we're about to break down exactly what the court said and why this decision is so devastating for Trump's presidency. All right, let's dig into what the Supreme Court actually said, because the legal reasoning here is important. It's not just that Trump lost, it's why he lost, and how the court's reasoning constrains him going forward. So we start with the tariffs. Trump imposed sweeping global tariffs, claimed he was doing it to protect American industry, to level the playing field in international trade, to punish countries that he said were taking advantage of America, and he claimed authority to do this under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is a law that gives the president certain powers during national emergencies, powers to regulate international economic transactions, to freeze assets, to impose sanctions, but it's supposed to be used for real emergencies, for situations where immediate action is needed to protect national security, not for general trade policy, not for things that should go through Congress. And Trump stretched the definition of emergency beyond recognition. declared that trade imbalances constituted an emergency, that America's trade deficit was a threat to national security, and therefore he could impose massive tariffs without congressional approval. And the Supreme Court said no, said that's not what the law means, said Congress never intended to give presidents that kind of authority, said that if the president could declare trade policy to be an emergency and act unilaterally, then the congressional power over trade would be meaningless because the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's explicit. That's in Article 1. And the president can't just take that power by declaring an emergency. The court explained that emergency powers have to be narrowly construed, have to be limited to actual emergencies, have to respect the fundamental allocation of powers in the Constitution, and Trump's trade policy doesn't qualify. It's not an emergency. It's just policy disagreement. It's Trump thinking Congress is doing trade wrong and deciding to do it himself, and that's not allowed. That's not how the system works. So the tariffs are struck down, every single one of them. Billions of dollars in tariff revenue that's been collected, it has to be refunded. Businesses that paid these tariffs are entitled to get their money back, and the economic policies built on tariff revenue, they have to be completely restructured. The court also emphasized the major questions doctrine. This is relatively new in Supreme Court jurisprudence. It's been developing over the last few years, and it says that when agencies or the executive branch claim authority to make decisions of vast economic and political significance, that authority must be clearly stated by Congress. You can't take a vague statute and interpret it to give yourself massive power, because if power that significant exists, Congress would have been explicit about granting it, would have debated it, would have made clear that's what they intended. And when you can't find that clear statement, when you're relying on vague language and creative interpretation, that's a sign you're claiming power you don't have. And that's exactly what happened with Trump's tariffs. He took the IEEPA, which is about emergencies, and interpreted it to give himself basically unlimited power over trade policy. And the court said that's exactly the kind of claim that falls under the major questions doctrine. If Congress wanted to give presidents power to reshape global trade through unilateral tariff declarations, they would have said so. They would have debated it. They would have made it explicit. The fact that they didn't means that power doesn't exist. And this reasoning is devastating for Trump because it applies to so much more than tariffs. Think about all the things Trump has tried to do by claiming executive authority: immigration policies, environmental regulations, healthcare rules, financial regulations, healthcare rules. So many of his actions have been based on taking vague statutory language and interpreting it broadly to give himself maximum power. And now the Supreme Court has said that approach doesn't work, has established a clear framework for evaluating these claims, and that framework requires clear congressional authorization for major decisions, which means a lot of Trump's other policies are now vulnerable, can be challenged using the same reasoning, can be struck down by lower courts applying this Supreme Court precedent. So this one decision has ripple effects across Trump's entire agenda, makes it much harder for him to govern by executive action, much harder to bypass Congress, much harder to claim authority he doesn't clearly have. The SNAP benefits part of the decision is also really important. For context, SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It provides food assistance to low-income families. Millions of Americans depend on it. And during the government shutdown, Trump's administration decided to only make partial payments, claimed they didn't have full funding because of the shutdown, and used it as leverage to pressure Democrats to agree to Trump's demands. But lower courts said that's not allowed, said the administration can't just arbitrarily reduce benefits, that there are legal requirements for how SNAP operates, that you can't use it as a political weapon. And Trump's administration appealed, tried to keep delaying, tried to avoid having to restore full payments. And the Supreme Court said no, said the lower courts were right, said the administration's actions were arbitrary and capricious, were not justified by any legal authority, were just political maneuvering at the expense of vulnerable families, and the court ordered immediate compliance, said the administration has to resume full SNAP payments now, can't delay further, can't keep appealing, has to do it. And this is significant because it shows the court drawing a line, saying there are things you can't do even if you're president. Even if you're in a political fight with Congress, you can't hurt millions of families to gain leverage, can't use essential government services as bargaining chips, have to maintain basic functions regardless of political disputes. And that limits Trump's playbook, because Trump has often used chaos and hardship as tools, has created or exploited crises to pressure opponents, has been willing to let people suffer if it gave him political advantage. And now the court is saying there are limits, are saying that approach violates administrative law, violates constitutional principles, and won't be tolerated, and that constrains how Trump can fight his battles going forward, makes it harder for him to manufacture crises, harder for him to use government functions as weapons, harder for him to govern through chaos. The composition of the court makes this ruling even more remarkable. because this isn't a liberal court. This is a court with a conservative supermajority, a court where Trump appointed 3 justices, a court that usually gives the executive branch broad deference. And even this court said Trump went too far. Even conservative justices who generally support presidential power said this crosses the line, said unchecked executive authority threatens the constitutional system, said the balance between branches matters, said limits have to be enforced. And when you have conservative justices saying that, when you have Trump's own appointees ruling against him, that's devastating politically, because it undermines Trump's narrative that he's being persecuted by liberal judges, undermines his claims that any ruling against him is partisan. When the justices he appointed say he's wrong, when they say his claims of authority are excessive, that's really hard to dismiss as bias or political attack. Legal analysts are calling this a watershed moment because it represents the court drawing clear lines around presidential power. For the last few years, there's been concern that courts were being too deferential to Trump, were letting him get away with things that previous presidents couldn't, were allowing executive power to expand in dangerous ways. And this decision shows that there are still limits, still jurists who will enforce constitutional constraints, still a judiciary that can check executive excess, and that matters for democracy, because if the president can claim unlimited emergency powers, if he can bypass Congress on major policy questions, if he can ignore court orders without consequence, then the system of checks and balances breaks down. Then you don't have separated powers anymore. You have an imperial presidency, and the court is saying that's not acceptable, is using this case to reaffirm that limits exist and will be enforced. The immediate financial consequences are also massive. Billions of dollars in tariff revenue have to be refunded. That's money that was collected from businesses, money that's now been spent or allocated, and it has to be given back. That creates enormous administrative challenges, creates budget problems, creates legal issues about exactly how refunds get processed and who's entitled to what. And beyond the refunds, there are all the economic policies that were built on the assumption of tariff revenue, infrastructure projects, defense spending, programs that were funded through tariff money. All of that has to be restructured, has to find new funding sources, and some of it might just have to be cut, because without tariff revenue, the budget doesn't work, the math doesn't add up, and Congress has to figure out how to deal with that, has to either find new revenue or reduce spending, and that's going to be a political nightmare, because nobody wants to raise taxes and nobody wants to cut popular programs. So Trump's tariff policy didn't just fail legally, it created a fiscal mess that will take years to sort out. So let's break down what this Supreme Court defeat actually means, why it's Trump's biggest legal loss, what the implications are for his presidency, and what happens next. Because this isn't just one ruling, this is a fundamental reshaping of the legal landscape around Trump's authority. A clear statement from the highest court that presidential power has limits, and those limits will be enforced. So this matters enormously, for Trump personally, for his policy agenda, for the balance of power in government, and for the precedent it sets going forward. Let's unpack all of that. First, the immediate policy impact. Trump's global tariffs are gone, invalid, have to be unwound. This was a central piece of his economic policy, something he campaigned on, something he claimed was making America stronger, and now it's been ruled illegal. The economic consequences ripple out in every direction. Businesses that pay tariffs get refunds. International trade relationships have to be rebuilt. Supply chains that adapted to the tariff regime have to adapt again, and the federal budget loses billions in expected revenue. This isn't a small adjustment. This is a fundamental restructuring of Trump's economic approach, and it happens at the worst possible time, when the administration is already dealing with shutdown fallout, already facing budget crises, already struggling with cabinet dysfunction, and now add a massive judicial defeat that invalidates core economic policies. That's a recipe for chaos. Second, the legal precedent. This decision doesn't just affect tariffs, it establishes principles that apply across the board. The major questions doctrine is now firmly established. Courts will use it to evaluate all kinds of executive actions. Whenever Trump or his agencies claim broad authority based on vague statutory language, courts will apply this test. We'll ask whether Congress clearly granted that authority, and if the answer is no, if the authority is just being inferred or extrapolated, courts will strike it down. This makes it much harder for Trump to govern by executive action, much harder to bypass Congress, much harder to implement sweeping policies without explicit legislative authorization. And Trump's entire approach has been based on maximizing executive power, on doing as much as possible without congressional approval. And now the Supreme Court has made that approach much more difficult, much more legally vulnerable. Third, the political impact. Trump built his brand on winning, on being strong, on never backing down. And now the Supreme Court has dealt him a crushing public defeat, has rejected his core economic policy, has questioned his understanding of presidential power, has ruled against him, even though he appointed justices to the court. And that damages his image, makes him look weak, makes him look legally incompetent, makes supporters question whether he's really winning, and it emboldens opponents, makes them more aggressive in challenging Trump, makes them confident that courts will back them up, creates momentum for more legal challenges, more attempts to use the judiciary to constrain Trump's presidency. Because if the Supreme Court is willing to rule against him this decisively, then maybe other courts will too. Maybe judges who were hesitant to check Trump will be more willing now. Maybe the floodgates open for judicial oversight. Fourth, the financial liability. This is huge. Businesses that pay tariffs are entitled to refunds. We're talking billions of dollars. And processing those refunds creates massive administrative challenges. The government has to figure out who paid what, how much is owed, how to distribute refunds, and do all of that quickly because courts have ordered immediate compliance. And Trump's administration isn't exactly known for efficient, competent implementation. So this is going to be messy. Going to involve lawsuits from businesses claiming they're owed more than they're being offered. Going to involve fights over exactly how the refund process works. Going to create years of litigation and administrative headaches. And all of that costs money, costs political capital, keeps Trump on defense, keeps the story alive, keeps reminding people that his tariff policy was illegal. Fifth, the implications for other legal battles. Trump has multiple ongoing court cases, multiple investigations, multiple claims of executive privilege and immunity. And this Supreme Court decision weakens all of those because the reasoning here, the emphasis on limits to presidential power, it applies to those cases too. When Trump claims he's immune from prosecution, when he claims executive privilege protects everything he did as president, when he tries to shield his records or his allies from investigation, courts can point to this decision, can say the Supreme Court has made clear that presidential power has limits, that claims of unlimited authority won't be accepted, that constitutional constraints apply to everyone, including the president. So this decision becomes ammunition for prosecutors and investigators, becomes a tool for forcing Trump to comply with subpoenas and court orders, becomes precedent that undermines his defensive strategies. 6. Congressional implications. Congress has been struggling to check Trump, struggling to enforce subpoenas, struggling to conduct oversight, and Trump has resisted at every turn, claimed executive privilege, directed subordinates not to testify, refused to produce documents, and argued that Congress can't make him do anything. And now the Supreme Court has reinforced that congressional powers matter, has said that separation of powers includes limits on the executive, has created a legal framework that supports congressional oversight, so members of Congress can use this decision to justify their investigations, to push back against Trump's stonewalling, to argue that courts will support them if they enforce subpoenas, and that makes congressional oversight more viable, more likely to succeed, more of a real check on presidential power. 7th, the precedent for future presidents. This decision isn't just about Trump. It's about defining the limits of executive power for all future presidents. And the court has drawn clear lines, has said emergency powers can't be abused, has said Congress's constitutional authorities can't be usurped, has said the major questions doctrine applies to executive actions. And all of that constrains future presidents too, makes it harder for anyone, regardless of party, to claim unlimited authority, to bypass Congress, to govern unilaterally. And that's good for democracy, good for the constitutional system, because concentrated power is dangerous no matter who holds it, and having clear limits, having judicial enforcement of those limits, that protects the system, protects against authoritarian drift, protects the balance that makes representative democracy work. 8. Trump's response and how it plays out. Trump isn't going to accept this quietly. He's going to attack the court, attack the decision, claim it's unfair, claim the justices he appointed betrayed him, rally his base by claiming persecution, and that creates its own dynamics. Because attacking the Supreme Court is risky. The court is supposed to be above politics, respected as an independent branch. And when a president attacks it, when he tries to delegitimize it, that can backfire, can make him look like he doesn't respect the rule of law, can make him look dangerous, can cost him support among people who care about institutions. But Trump doesn't have many other options. He can't just accept defeat, can't just admit his tariff policy was illegal, has to fight back somehow. And attacking the court is his most likely move. The refund process is going to dominate headlines for weeks or months. Every business that's owed money will be watching. Every delay or problem will generate stories, and Democrats will use every one of those stories to highlight Trump's illegal policies, to argue that he acted recklessly, that he imposed tariffs without proper authority, that businesses and consumers paid the price, and that he should never have done it in the first place. So this isn't a story that goes away. It's a story that unfolds over time, that generates new headlines, new political problems, new opportunities for Trump's opponents to attack him, and all of that weakens his presidency, makes it harder for him to recover from his other problems. makes it harder for him to rebuild his image or his agenda. The major questions doctrine is going to reshape administrative law, going to change how agencies operate, going to constrain what they can do without explicit congressional authorization, and that affects everything: environmental policy, healthcare policy, financial regulation, labor law, technology regulation. All of it becomes harder to do through executive action. All of it requires clear congressional mandate, and that might force Congress to actually legislate, to actually make decisions, to actually debate and vote on major policy questions instead of leaving everything to executive discretion. And that could be healthy for democracy, could restore Congress as a co-equal branch, could force compromise and deliberation, or it could lead to gridlock, could mean nothing gets done because Congress can't agree, could paralyze government. We'll see how it plays out. But either way, it's a major shift in how government operates. So yeah, this is Trump's biggest legal defeat, not because it's the most dramatic, not because it involves criminal charges or impeachment, but because it fundamentally constrains his presidency, invalidates core policies, establishes precedents that limit his authority, creates legal tools for opponents to check him, and damages his political image all at once. This is a massive blow, and Trump knows it, his team knows it, and they're scrambling to figure out how to respond, how to minimize the damage, how to spin this as something other than the crushing defeat it is. But there's no good spin here. The Supreme Court said Trump was wrong, said his understanding of presidential power is excessive, said his policies are illegal, and there's no appealing beyond the Supreme Court. This is final, this is binding, this is the law, and Trump has to deal with it. We'll be watching how this unfolds, how Trump responds, how it affects his other legal battles, how it shapes the rest of his presidency, because this is a turning point. A moment when judicial checks on executive power were actually enforced, when limits meant something, when the Constitution still mattered. Stay tuned.